I have lived in this house for 43 years. Some days I think the walls remember more laughter than I do. Once there was music in every corner, children pounding out scales on the old piano, Amos humming tunelessly while he painted the porch railings. Now the house is so quiet, I can hear the tick of the clock all the way from the parlor. I still rise before dawn, even though there's no one who needs breakfast at 6. It feels wrong to sleep in. I brew coffee, wipe the counters, and polish the silver picture frame on the mantel. My favorite photograph of Amos and me on our wedding day. He wore that ridiculous navy suit he'd borrowed from his brother, too big in the shoulders. I was 25 and certain that nothing in the world could ever make me feel small. On the dresser in my bedroom, the velvet box waits. I lift the lid every morning. The sapphire pendant catches the light, the same deep blue as the sea behind our house. Amos gave it to me the last night he was here, when his voice was so thin I could hardly hear him. He pressed it into my hand and whispered, "It's yours. No matter what happens, it will always be yours." Sometimes I think that necklace is the only thing left that belongs to me alone. My children visit when it suits them. Stellan comes by with papers for me to sign contracts I never asked for. Maribel's voice is always sweet when she asks if I've considered moving into assisted living. They call it caring. I wonder if they hear how hollow it sounds. I don't tell them how often I sit by the piano touching the keys I no longer have the strength to play, or how the evenings stretch so long it feels like the darkness might swallow me. Today is my 68th birthday. I woke before the dawn and started baking, just in case someone remembered. By noon, the kitchen was warm with the scent of lemon cake and coffee. I set out my mother's porcelain teacups, the ones with the tiny blue flowers, and folded the linen napkins into careful triangles. I told myself it didn't matter if no one came. But as the afternoon slipped by, the silence felt heavier with each passing hour. It was nearly 4 when I heard the front door creak open. My heart gave a foolish leap. I wiped my hands on my apron and tried to smooth my hair before stepping into the hallway. Leora stood there, still in her school uniform, her backpack slipping off one shoulder. She didn't look up from her phone. "Hi, Grandma." She mumbled, her thumbs tapping out a message. "Mom said to tell you she's working late. Uncle Stellan's got a meeting or something." I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. "That's all right. I'm glad you came." She followed me into the kitchen and sat at the table, staring at the screen in her palm. I poured us tea and cut a slice of cake for her. She picked at it with the side of her fork, barely tasting it. After a long stretch of silence, she glanced toward the corner cabinet where the velvet box used to rest. "Is that necklace real?" she asked, her voice flat. "It is," I said, feeling my cheeks warm. "Your grandfather gave it to me." Leora didn't reply. Her eyes dropped back to her phone. I looked at her smooth young face and wondered if she would ever understand why it mattered so much to me, or why it hurt to see her look at it like it was just another thing to be measured and discussed. When she finally stood to leave, I walked her to the door. She gave me a quick hug light as a breeze and disappeared down the porch steps without another word. I closed the door behind her and pressed my palm against the cool wood, listening to the silence settle in again. I carried the untouched cake to the dining room, set it down, and told myself I wouldn't cry. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept circling the same hollow ache, replaying the look on Leora's face when she asked about the necklace. I lay in the dark, listening to the wind brush the eaves, trying to remember the last time any of them had come just to see me, not to check on the house or the valuables tucked inside it. Around midnight, I drifted into a restless doze. I must have only been asleep for an hour when a faint noise pulled me back. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but then I heard the floor creak, a deliberate step near the front hall. I held my breath, straining to hear. Another footstep, soft but unmistakable. I eased out of bed, heart thudding, and pulled my robe tight around me. In the dim light spilling from the kitchen nightlight, I saw her. Leora crouched in front of the small drawer under the entry table, her thin shoulders rigid with tension. "Leora," I whispered. My voice sounded steady, though my hands were trembling. She jerked upright, her eyes wide with guilt and something that looked like fear. She clutched her phone against her chest, like it might protect her from what she'd just done. "I'm sorry," she blurted. "Grandma, I wasn't taking anything." My mouth felt dry. "Then what are you doing here, sweetheart?" She swallowed hard, blinking fast. "I needed to tell you. I heard Mom on the phone. She and Uncle Stellan, they were talking about your necklace. I felt something in me go cold. They said they were going to come tonight," Leora whispered. "That you probably wouldn't remember in the morning. They said you're getting forgetful." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know if I should say anything, but I thought you should know." I stepped forward and gathered her in my arms, feeling how small she still was, how her heart beat as fast as mine. When she pulled back, she looked like she might cry. I held her gaze and promised her I understood. After Leora slipped out into the cold night, I stood there in the hallway, the shadows pooling around my feet. My heart was beating so hard, it felt like it might bruise the inside of my ribs. I pressed a hand to my chest and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. They had planned this as if I were already half gone, as if my mind were too soft to notice the theft. I thought of Amos, how he'd trusted me to guard the necklace, and a spark of something old and unyielding flickered back to life inside me. I moved slowly through the house, checking each door, each lock. When I was sure everything was secure, I went to the piano bench and eased the cushion aside. Underneath was the small compartment Amos had built long ago. He used to call it our secret vault, a place no one would think to look. My hands were steady as I retrieved the velvet box from the cabinet and laid it gently inside the hollow space. I closed the bench and pressed down until I heard the latch click. For a moment, I just stood there, palm flat against the polished wood. My reflection in the piano's glossy surface looked older than I remembered, but her eyes were clear. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, then took my notebook from the drawer and wrote down everything Leora had told me. I dated the page and underlined the names. If they meant to treat me like a confused old woman, I would give them proof I still knew exactly what was real. Before I went upstairs, I picked up the phone and called Celine Chapin's office. The voicemail answered in her warm, measured voice. "It's Seraphine," I said after the tone. "I need to update my will, and I'd like to set up protections for certain assets." I ended the call and set the receiver down. In the sudden quiet, I felt a calm resolve settle over me like a second skin. I turned out the kitchen light and moved to the window, watching the yard until the sky began to pale. By evening, I had almost convinced myself they wouldn't really do it. That maybe Leora had misunderstood. That some small, kinder version of them would show up at my door with apologies instead of schemes. But when Stellan's car pulled into the drive just after dusk, I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't bother to turn on the porch light. Let them wonder if I'd been waiting in the dark for them. He knocked twice before pushing the door open without waiting for me to answer. Maribel trailed behind him, carrying a foil-covered casserole she set on the counter like a peace offering. "Mom, Stellan said," with that same careful tone he used when he wanted me to feel fragile. "We were in the neighborhood. Thought we'd check in on you." I folded my arms across my chest. "You came to check on the necklace." Maribel's eyes darted to Stellan before she forced a bright smile. "That's not fair, Seraphine. We're worried about you. You've seemed scattered." I looked between them, remembering how tiny Stellan's hands were the first time I held him, how he used to cry if I left the room. It made something twist deep in my chest. "I'm not scattered," I said evenly. "I'm tired." tired of pretending not to notice when you circle around me like scavengers." Stellan's jaw tightened. "You don't have to be cruel. I'm being honest," I corrected him, "which is more than either of you has managed." Maribel stepped closer, her voice dropping to something meant to sound soothing. "We could help you, you know. It doesn't have to feel like a burden. The necklace, the finances. It's not a burden," I said. "It's mine." The word landed between us like a stone. Stellan tried again. "Just let us take the necklace somewhere safe, Mom. You'd sleep easier." I met his eyes and saw no remorse there, only calculation. I shook my head and turned away, feeling their disappointment as I walked into the hall and left them standing in my kitchen. After they left, I locked the door and leaned against it, feeling the air finally clear of their voices. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was something closer to fury, a hot pulse of anger I hadn't let myself feel in years. I turned off the lights and walked to the piano. The bench was closed, the necklace safe. My heart eased a little at the thought that Amos would have approved of my caution. He always said I was too trusting. I lifted the lid of the piano and pressed one key, the low A that used to be his favorite. The note hung in the room, warm and mournful, like it was calling something back to me. I sat down and let my hands rest on the keys. My fingers didn't have the strength they once did, but I still remembered every piece he loved to hear. I started to play the first bars of our song, the one I'd practiced over and over when we were newly married. My eyes blurred as I remembered him standing behind me, humming along. He'd put his hand on my shoulder always, so gentle, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. The necklace had been his last gift pressed into my palm when his skin was already so cold. "It's yours," he'd whispered. "No matter what happens, no matter who comes asking it, belongs to you." I hadn't thought much about those words back then. I'd been too hollowed out by grief. But tonight, they felt like a promise I was finally ready to keep. I closed the piano and traced the smooth wood with my fingertips. In the reflection of the polished surface, I saw my own face drawn and older, but steadier than it had been in a long time. I rose and went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. As I lifted it to my lips, I thought about the way Stellan had looked at me, how sure he'd been that he could take whatever he wanted without consequence. I set the glass down and knew I was done pretending I didn't see who he'd become. I didn't bother going upstairs to bed that night. I knew if I lay down, my thoughts would only turn circles around me, picking at old memories and fresh disappointments. So I stayed in the dining room, the lamp off the quiet, pressing in on every side. Around 2 a.m, the house settled with a sigh. I closed my eyes and counted my breaths. I was almost convinced I had imagined everything when the side door creaked open. The cold draft came first, brushing across my ankles. Then the soft scuff of a shoe on the tile. I kept still, my hands folded in my lap. My heart climbed up into my throat, but I forced myself to stay silent. The footsteps moved cautiously through the kitchen. I heard the faint metallic clink of the cabinet latch, the hush of drawers sliding open. He was looking for the box. I waited until I saw the shape of him crossing into the living room. His shoulders hunched, head down, the same posture he'd had as a boy when he'd been caught stealing cookies before dinner. For a moment, my heart twisted, wanting to pretend this was some harmless mistake, but I knew better now. When he reached for the display cabinet, I leaned forward and flicked on the lamp beside me. The sudden light flooded the room, catching his face in sharp relief. Stellan froze his hand, hovering over the drawer pull. His mouth opened and shut twice before any words came out. "Mom," he started, his voice hoarse. I didn't give him the chance to finish. "You're not welcome here tonight?" I said, my voice calm in a way that surprised me. "If you take one more step, I will call the police." He straightened slowly, his eyes searching mine for any softness. He found none. We stayed like that, staring at each other across the living room until he looked away first and let his hand drop to his side. His eyes darted to the front door as if measuring how quickly he could leave before I made good on my threat. He opened his mouth again, but I held up a hand to stop whatever excuse he was about to offer. I was tired of hearing him explain why my life, my home, my memories were things he had a right to manage. "I know why you're here," I said, "and you will not pretend otherwise." "Mom?" He began, a note of pleading in his voice. "You're not thinking clearly. You've been confused." "No," I cut in. "I've never been clearer." His mouth pressed into a tight line. He looked older in that moment, worn out by debts he hadn't admitted to, by plans he'd made behind my back. For the first time, I didn't feel pity, just a cold, steady resolve. "I have spoken to Celine Chapin," I told him. "My will is being updated and you will not be managing anything that belongs to me." He swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbing, like he was fighting the urge to argue. "You're making a mistake," he whispered. "If you'd just let us help you, wouldn't have to worry about any of this." I felt a flicker of sadness then, but it didn't soften my voice. "The only mistake I made was letting you believe I couldn't see what you were doing." He looked past me toward the piano bench like he still hoped the necklace might be hidden somewhere close enough to grab. I stepped into his line of sight, blocking that last desperate glimmer of entitlement. "If you come into this house again without my invitation, I will call the police," I said. "And I won't feel guilty for it." His jaw clenched. For a moment I thought he might say something hateful, but he turned away instead. He walked past me to the door and pulled it open, without looking back. When it closed behind him, I stood in the hush that followed, feeling something release in my chest that had been knotted tight for years. For 3 weeks, the phone didn't ring. No calls from Stellan or Maribel. No polite check-ins pretending nothing had happened. The quiet felt like a relief and a wound all at once. Some days, I caught myself listening for the sound of Stellan's car in the drive, even though I knew better than to hope. I spent my mornings tidying the house room by room. I sorted drawers and folded linens that hadn't been touched in years. I made lists of things I wanted to put in order, while my mind was still sharp enough that no one could claim otherwise. Each small task helped to calm the nervous energy that flared up whenever I replayed that night. Sometimes, when the evenings came early and the darkness pooled in the corners, I would sit at the piano bench with my palm resting over the hidden compartment. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Just knowing the necklace was still there, safe where I'd placed it, made me feel like a part of Amos was still beside me, steady and sure. It was Leora who finally broke the silence. One afternoon, I heard her knock, soft and uncertain. When I opened the door, she looked up at me with wide, worried eyes. "I'm sorry," she said before I could speak. "Mom's been so angry. She says I shouldn't have told you anything." I touched her cheek, feeling the damp warmth where tears had already begun to fall. "You did the right thing," I whispered. "I didn't want you to be alone," she murmured, voice trembling. I pulled her close and held her until her shoulders stopped shaking. I wanted her to know that even if everything else felt cracked and broken, she was the one thing that hadn't disappointed me. After she left, I stood in the doorway for a long time, breathing in the cold afternoon air. I didn't feel regret for anything I'd done, only the certainty that I wouldn't let myself be made small again. I turned back inside and closed the door, already thinking about what I needed to do next. Spring came early that year. The snow melted from the porch steps in March, leaving damp patches that dried to pale streaks under the sun. I opened the windows most mornings, letting the salt-tinged breeze roll through the rooms until the air felt new again. I planted hyacinths under the bay window where Amos used to sit with his coffee. Their purple blooms were the first thing I saw each morning when I stepped onto the porch. For the first time in years, I felt like I was choosing something for myself instead of waiting for someone to tell me what I should want. On Tuesdays, I started going to the library's piano circle. I didn't always play, but I liked listening to the others, watching their hands shape the songs that had once been the center of my life. Sometimes when the mood struck, I joined in, and the keys felt familiar under my fingers, even if my hands tired faster than they used to. I saw Leora more often, too. She would stop by after school, her backpack slung low on her shoulders, and sit with me at the kitchen table while she did her homework. We didn't talk much about her parents, and she never asked about the necklace again. But when she hugged me before leaving, I could tell she understood more than anyone her age should have to. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, she looked at me across the table and said, "You look happier." I didn't have to think before I answered. "I am." I knew I could never make Stellan into the son I wished he had been any more than I could bring Amos back or turn the years around. But I could choose how the story would end. I could decide that the last part of my life wouldn't belong to anyone else. That night, I sat by the piano, pressing a single note over and over, letting it fade into the quiet. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like something to be afraid of.